Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's Authors at Google event. With us is David Hajdu, one of, I think, our country's preeminent writers about music and pop culture. He is a professor at Columbia University's Graduate School of Journalism and a columnist for The New Republic. His work has also appeared in the New York Times Magazine, The Atlantic, the New York Review of Books, The New Yorker, and Vanity Fair, among other publications. His previous two books, Lush Life, a biography of Billy Strayhorn, and Positively 4th Street, the lives and times of Joan Baez, Bob Dylan, Mimi Baez, Farina, and Richard Farina, were both nominated as finalists for the National Book Critics Circle Award. He's here today to speak to us about his new book, The Tencent Plague, The Great Comic Book Scare and How It Changed America. David will be speaking and then taking questions from the audience. If you do have a question during the Q&A session, please queue up at the microphone in the center aisle there, as we are recording for YouTube as always. After the event, David will be signing books for anyone who's interested in sticking around. So please join me in welcoming David Hajdu to Google.
Thank you, Ricky. It's a big thrill for me to be here. It's a thrill and a source of enormous frustration to be speaking at a place within 30 feet proximity to a pool table, where it's nice to talk to you, but if anybody wants to play a game after the talk, I'd really much rather be over there. I'm going to talk for a bit about my new book, about the Tencent Plague. I'm going to talk a bit about the books I wrote prior to that, to my first two books, Lush Life, a biography of Billy Strayhorn, and I'll talk about my second book, Positively 4th Street. It's a group portrait of four figures from the 1960s folk scene, Joan Baez, Bob Dylan, Mimi Baez, Farina, and Richard Farina. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about, I know it's lunchtime, I'm going to talk about research methodology. You may, run like, like a herd out of here, the notion of hearing about research methodology here. But I want to talk to you a little bit about the methods that I use and some of what goes into the books that I write and why I use the methods that I write. So, okay. First of all, I'll tell you a bit about the Tencent Plague. It's just published a couple of days ago. So you probably don't know that much about it. It's a narrative history of, I'm going to read from notes for a while because it just was published a couple of days ago, and I'm sort of getting used to doing this myself. It's a narrative history about the emergence of a certain sphere of comic books, not all comic books. It's not about superhero comic books. It's not about the kinds of comics you may think of when you think of comics. It's not about Batman and Superman and Wonder Woman elementally. It's about another sphere of comics that emerged in the early post-war years, the late 1940s and 1950s, that were centered on crime and horror and lust and vice, and they were very lurid and dark and noirish. It's about the emergence of those comics, how they emerged, the people who made them, and the people who read them, and the effect of those comics on the lives of their creators, the lives of their readers, and the lives of the culture at large. In many ways, it's a war story, because it's a story of a conflict over these comics, a war over these comics. It's so in one sense, it's a story of the emergence of a school of work. It's a history of a school of work emerging, and then it's a story about a battle over that work. And the battle centered on conflict between two generations, about the pre-war generation, the World War II, the greatest generation, in Tom Brokaw's phrase, and then the emerging post-war generation. And it's a conflict between two sets of institutions, the formal institutions of the government and other institutions that reinforced and the status quo in this time, and the more freewheeling ad hoc institutions of the comic book industry and comics makers and readers. So a couple other ways of looking at this is it's a conflict between the protectors of the prevailing conceptions of social propriety, moral values and aesthetic values on one hand, and on the other hand, a breed of cultural and aesthetic insurgents who were challenging all those values through these comic books. So that's what the Tencent Plague is about. It's the word plague has two meanings in the title. On one sense, it refers to the contagion that the cultural establishment thought comics to be. They thought of comics as something that was insidious, that was infecting young people, and in turn ran the risk of infecting the entire culture. And in fact, it did, I think. It did. It did deeply affect the entire culture. I don't think infect is the correct term, but it deeply affected the culture at large. And then the result of this conflict, this battle over comics, was that the cultural establishment, the government, and the other institutions that reinforced the status quo clamped down on comics and affected the near end of the industry. They practically killed the industry in a parallel to the Red Scare and the McCarthy era. It's very similar to what happened to the Hollywood screenwriters and actors who had associations with leftist politics in the same era. And the comic book artists and writers who suffered as a result of this thought of the clampdown on comics as a plague. So to them, that was the plague. It's not well known today, to those of us who think of comics and have the contemporary frame of reference, that comics in the 1940s and 1950s didn't appeal just to fans who collected them and kept them in sealed containers, but rather were the most popular form of entertainment in America. Comic books sold between 60 and 100 million copies every week. And then they were traded to another, I don't know, depending on whose statistics you read, another 6 to 10 people traded them. 60 to 100 million copies, and that means comic books were reaching more eyes than television. Because television was just emerging then. It was reaching more people than radio. Radio was in decline, reaching more people than movies or any other mode of communication. Comic books were popular culture in the late 1940s and early 1950s. By 1952, more than 20 publishers were producing nearly 650 comics titles per month, and they were employing well over 1,000 people. A great many of them, by the end of this purge, the clampdown on comics in the early 1950s, were out of work, and many of them were never published again. Comics in those days were a really freewheeling art form that were created by outsiders of various sorts who thought of comics as a mode of way of expressing a pride in their outsider status. And they also felt that comics was a place where they were welcome. I'm talking, when I say outsiders, I mean first-generation immigrants, members of minority groups, a great many Jews and Italians, a great many women, more women than you may think, African Americans, Japanese Americans. Many of the key early comic book artists were handicapped, outsiders in other ways, social outsiders, and they felt that in comics they were welcome. I heard a story that was not atypical from a comics artist named David Gantz, who told me about taking his portfolio of samples to an advertising agency and having the advertising exec look at the samples and say, well, this is very good, but the people look awfully European, meaning look awfully ethnic. And Will Eisner is an important, towering figure in the comic book history, told me that he didn't even bother applying to advertising agencies or trying to get work as an illustrator, and he could have done conventional illustration because he came up in the heyday of illustration, because the advertisements for the advertising agencies, in many cases listed on the bottom, the phrases like a Christian company or restricted. And he didn't even bother applying. But he felt that in comic books he was welcome because nobody was watching. There were no system of oversight in comics. There was no FCC regulating comics, no Hays Commission as there was in the movie industry. There were laws governing obscenity. but they didn't apply to what comic book makers were doing. So comic books were kind of a freewheeling environment. I want to read a little section. Hold on. This is on camera. Hold on. I'll read a brief section from my book, very brief. I'm not going to stand here and read for a long time. That just gives you a sense of just how free the environment was those days. This involves a comic book packager named Harry A. Chesler, Jr., and he used quotation marks around the A, the middle initial A, and one of his artists named Irwin Hasen. And I'm just going to read a couple paragraphs from the book. Harry A. Chesler, Jr., the comic book packager, applied the junior to his name or dispensed with it as he saw fit and put quotation marks around the initial because he thought they were stylistically correct, and he had a point about that. When he was asked what the A stood for, he said, anything. Indiscrimination was his middle name. Stubby and gray-skinned, he dressed in striped shirts, That's a compliment, not a slur. Dressed in striped shirts and a suit vest that often but not always matched the pants. He kept a derby laid flat atop his head all day, indoors, and he was usually smoking a cigar, proportionately stubby and also gray, with the label intact, a fancy label that could impress anyone who did not know much about cigars. Chesler, a stickler for efficiency, had minimized the creative effort required of his artists to render him in caricature. He set up his studio in a long, open workspace, last used by a wholesaler of buttons and zippers for the garment trade, on a 10-story, half-block-long building on East 29th Street in Manhattan. Chesler filled the room with rows of used desks, which were cheaper than drawing tables, and he lorded over the shop as if it were a gangland fiefdom. Anyone arriving at work, it's a little different than Google, I think. Anyone arriving at work 5 minutes late would be docked an hour's wages. And on payday, he would sit behind the desk in his office, summon the artists one by one, and ask each of them, how much do you need this week to get by? End of quote. Late in 1939, Irwin Hasen, a young artist, joined Chesler's staff. Hasen was just beginning to work professionally in art, and at 21, he was still living with his parents, who had a furniture business go bankrupt and were rock skipping from apartment to apartment in Manhattan to avoid going under. Hasen was an all-around artsy fellow who could have passed for Mickey Rooney's more effervescent, smaller brother. He had a good compositional sense and applied himself to his assignments for Chesler, among the first of which was a detective story about a counterfeiting ring published by Time, a company that later became Marvel. Not long after Hasen had stacked the pages and submitted them to his boss, Chesler walked over to his drawing table and told him, "Good work, kid. That's a hell of a job you did today. I'm going to play that up big." At the end of the day, as Hasen cleared up his materials, he realized that he had inadvertently given Chesler only the top page of the story he had done. All the sheets of the drawing board underneath it were blank. That's when I learned, and Hasen told me in an interview, that's when I learned something about the comic book business at that point in time. Hasen said, it was going gangbusters no matter what you did, and nobody was really paying any attention. Nobody cared what the heck was actually on the pages. It's true. They could be blank, and nobody would notice. I wouldn't be surprised if Chesler sent those pages to the printer, Hasen said. So what happened while nobody was looking was that comics artists and writers indulged their senses of frustration with the status quo and their fantasies, and comics got stranger and stranger and darker and darker and more lurid until the establishment decided to clamp down. And in the early 1950s, there were over 100 pieces of legislation on the state or the local level to regulate comics or render the sale of comics of various kinds illegal, to outlaw, to ban the sale of comic books. Community groups organized, church groups organized, PTAs organized, the American Legion organized, and the combination of laws against comics and the grassroots actions enacted the near death of the industry. Beginning in 1945, there were public bonfires of comics, and not just one isolated incident in a rural community. There were dozens of them all around America. The first ones took place in 1945, just a few months after there were bonfires of books somewhere else. I interviewed quite a few of the kids who took part in those bonfires and talked to them about what went through their minds when they were burning those books and collecting those books. One of them took place in Spencer, West Virginia. Went down there and saw the location and interviewed the kid who led the burning, and another took place in Wisconsin Rapids, Wisconsin. I talked to some people there. Another one took place in Binghamton, New York, and I met one of the kids who was involved in the burning there. His name is Paul Plasinski, and he told me a little story that's indicative of how torn young people were about comics and their place in the world. Because on one hand, kids felt like many kids felt like they didn't want to be juvenile delinquents and do something that was awful. On the other hand, they didn't see what was so bad about comics. They wanted to do the right thing, so they went along with this, but didn't see how reading and buying comic books was such a bad thing. And Plasinski told a story about gathering the comics for the bonfire and pulling out the Jungle Girl comics, which were a genre of category of comics very historically accurate about shapely blonde white jungle girls who protected the native populations from pirates and such by swinging from vines in leopard skin bikinis. And so Plasinski was gathering the comics for this bonfire, and he pulled out the jungle comics, set them aside, brought them home to hide and keep. And he lifted up the cushion of the sofa in his living room only to find his father's detective magazines there. So the hiding place was already taken. Strange and comical, kind of whimsical and irrelevant, not irrelevant, but odd as events like that might seem to us today. This purge was taken gravely seriously at the time in the 1940s, in the early 1950s. There were hundreds upon hundreds of magazine stories and newspaper stories around the country on this crisis. There, as I said, there were over 100 pieces of legislation, and when the comic book business nearly went out of business, when the comic book industry nearly died, is a better way to put that, hundreds of artists were put out of work, and many of whom never worked again. So that's essentially what the book is about. I want to talk, while I have you, a bit about why I did this book and why I thought it was worth doing, how it fits into the chronology of books that I've done over the years, because I've done 3 books now, and I want to share with you a bit about how I've done these books, because I thought it might be of interest to you here at Google. I try to tell untold stories. Now, it's partly because I was trained as a journalist. I've been a journalist for many years, and I teach journalism at Columbia. So I know that, a journalist thinks of seeking the news. So we think of a story that nobody yet knows has obvious news value. If I can't tell a story that, okay. I also, being a journalist, like to find the witnesses of the event so I could interview people. So rather than rely on secondary research or what's already been told or what's already been on the record about somebody, I like to find the people who were there. Now, this is difficult to do if you're telling an untold story. An untold story is difficult to research by the very nature of the fact that it hasn't been told before. If a story hasn't been told, how do you research it? If no one has talked about it before, how do you find the people to talk to? So you really can't always Google them or use conventional methods to find these people and to find these stories. So I want to talk to you a little bit about what I went through. I thought you might be interested. When I was doing my first book, Lush Life, was about a composer who was very little known at the time that I was doing the research. I started the research in the mid-1980s, and I finished the book 11 years later. It was published in 1996. And it took me 11 years to conduct about 400 interviews and to do other kinds of research to bring to light a life that had been lost in the shadows, lost to history. The subject of the book was Billy Strayhorn, who worked largely in anonymity for Duke Ellington by choice, because Strayhorn was a triple minority. He was African American, gay, and he was the closest thing that, in the 1930s, to being out of the closet as possible, in that he never disguised who he was or pretended to be anything other than a gay man. So it makes, which was even rarer than being African American or gay, to be open about it in those days. He was a triple minority. So what he did is he sacrificed recognition for his work. He sacrificed fame and fortune, which is an extraordinary thing in this culture that reveres fame and glory above all else, in exchange for having his work performed by Duke Ellington. Most of his work was associated with Duke Ellington. Much of his work was credited to Duke Ellington. He wrote Take the A Train and a great many other masterpieces performed by Duke Ellington as well, including ballet scores, Broadway scores, film scores, orchestral suites, and hundreds of songs. So Strayhorn avoided the spotlight during his life, and was very little written about him when I started doing the book. The very little that was written about him, I soon found was not true, or was misleading. It was sketchy, or it was not true, because he wanted to avoid attention, and out of respect for him, his friends and colleagues, people who worked around him, thought they were protecting his secret, and they didn't talk about him and what he really did. So how much Strayhorn had really done for Ellington, the significance of Strayhorn in not only the Duke Ellington canon, but in the canon of 20th century American music, was not known. So I had to find the people who were there and interview them. And I'll tell you a little story about what I went through. When I started my research, I didn't realize that Strayhorn had written as much as he'd had, and I didn't realize that he had a career on his own before he met Ellington, because the conventional Strayhorn had said, and Ellington had said, and it found its way into print, that he had been an amateur musician in his hometown in Pittsburgh, and that it was only after Duke kind of plucked him from obscurity and groomed him that Strayhorn did anything of consequence. So that's what I thought the truth was when I started the project. That's what Strayhorn had said, that's what Ellington had said, that was what was on the record, that was in the brief bios of Billy Strayhorn that I found. I had no reason to believe otherwise. So I knew he was an arranger, so I was interviewing. I thought, well, if I'm writing a book about an arranger, I should interview other jazz arrangers. So I interviewed an arranger named Billy May, who was well known for arranging for Frank Sinatra, but came from Pittsburgh. So I thought, well, okay, here's an arranger about Strayhorn's age, and I could talk to him about arranging. So I'm doing an interview with Billy May about arranging, and he said, and toward the end of what I thought was the end of the interview, he mentioned, I played with Strayhorn in a little band he had in Pittsburgh. I said, he had a band in Pittsburgh? Oh yeah, he had a little trio, like the Benny Goodman trio. He played piano, and what did he play? Oh, mostly his own stuff. He was writing songs before he met Duke. Oh yeah, they had a whole book. It was all Strayhorn stuff. Well, I have to find out about this band, to find out what music he's playing. What else can you tell me about the band? Billy May said, Billy May was a trumpeter, by the way, in those days, so he had sat in on trumpet with this trio. He said, well, I don't remember much, really. This is decades later. I remember the clarinetist, his name started with an E. I'm sorry, that's really all I remember. I'm sorry. So that's all that I had. So I knew that it was important to find this E guy and to find out about this band. And I had remembered a story that I had heard when I worked at Time Inc. I worked for 10 years at Time Inc., almost 10 years, at Entertainment Weekly. And there was a veteran of Time Inc. named Dick Stolley, who was the person who tracked down the Zapruder film in Dallas in November 1963. And Dick Stolley liked to tell the story about how he found the film and locked in the film for Time Inc. before the government got it. And the story that Stolley told was that he had heard a rumor that somebody was taking home movie footage that day. So he said, I have to find that footage. So he hired a couple dozen people and had phones set up in a room and got a couple dozen people, like 2 dozen people, to make phone calls to call everybody in the Dallas phone book. To ask everybody in Dallas, were you taking a home movie that day? And at some point early on in that process, he realized, geez, what if the CIA or the FBI is doing the same thing? I know, I'll start with the Z's and work backwards. So it was to his good fortune that the person who happened to have the film started with the initial ZA. So he locked in the film very early. And he got there and had the Zapruder sign a contract granting Time Inc. exclusive rights to the film, something like 15 or 20 minutes before the government knocked on the door. So I was remembering this story, and I thought, okay, I have to find this guy. Then I was thinking, so if this E person lived in Pittsburgh in the 1930s, there's a possibility that he's still there, because a generation of people who grew up before the rise of the interstate highway system in the 1950s didn't think of themselves as mobile as we think of ourselves today. The country was not as mobile as it is today, and people tended to stay put more than they do today. So I thought, with that thinking, there's a possibility that he could be an old man in Pittsburgh today. So I got myself a Pittsburgh phone book and spent months calling every person in the phone book whose name began with E. Now, if there's a faster way to do this today, I'd really like to hear about it after this speech, after this talk, because I still don't know a more efficient way of doing that for someone who wouldn't probably not have a computer, So I had this day job, and I would prop the phone up, and I would do my writing and editing for this. Entertainment Weekly was the magazine, and as I said, and and I had this little routine I would do, and I would say, I'm sorry, this was before a lot of cold calling went on, so there weren't automatic hang-ups in those days. It's not that long ago. If you called somebody, they might be likely to stay on the phone with you for a minute. And I just went through everybody in the phone book, and I had this little routine, and I would say, I'm sorry for bothering you. This might seem a little strange. I'm looking for somebody who was a clarinet player in the 1930s. Now, that's 50 years ago, okay? When I'm doing this, I'm asking for somebody who did something 50 years ago. Looking for a guy who in the 30s was playing clarinet, and he might have known a pianist named Billy Strayhorn. And I'm going to hang up, and everybody must say, hang up, cross off the name. 2.5 months down the line, a couple 100 names down the list, I'm going through the same thing, and the woman said, oh, that's my husband, hold on. So, hello, Jerry Eisner. Speak. Oh, Mr. Eisner, you worked with Billy Strayhorn? Yes, we had a trio together. Could I talk to you? Sure, come down. So this was a Thursday. So on Saturday, I was at his door in Pittsburgh, and he had never talked about Billy Strayhorn before because nobody had ever called him before. Nobody ever knew that there was a reason to call him before. So everything he had to tell me was new to the world. So he said, we're talking about the band. And I said, what did you play? Oh, I have the band book. Let me get it. And he went out into the garage where he had his stuff, and he came back with the original band book from 1936 with the original music in it. And I'm looking at it, and there's in Billy Strayhorn's handwriting, there's Lush Life. Here's Your Love Has Faded, which is copyrighted in the names of Duke Ellington and Billy Strayhorn. Here's Something to Live For, which is copyrighted in the name of Duke Ellington and Billy Strayhorn. Here's the Rosetta Stone, you know. And I said, what kind of music did Billy Strayhorn listen to? And he said, oh, well, I have his records. When he moved to New York, he gave me his record collection. So it's in the garage. So it's in no temperature control. It's like there's a case of oil to change his oil, and there's Billy Strayhorn's record collection. So there I could see exactly what influenced Billy Strayhorn as a listener. So that's one example of the benefit of grassroots research. Now, I was doing the research for this book. Do I have a little more time? Yeah. I want to tell you one more case study, case history of a different kind of the value of grassroots research. And that had to do with that I had my hands full researching this book, and actually all three of my books, in terms of being accepted, being welcomed by the witnesses, by the people who I'm interviewing. It was difficult in the case of the second book, which involves some celebrities because they're famous. They don't want to talk to people who aren't going to put them on the cover of People magazine. And it was difficult in the case of the first book because I was dealing with people who are African American, in many cases gay in quite a number of cases, and of a different generation than me. So here's somebody coming along 50 years later who's different seemingly in every way, wanting to do what? To write about this person? Why? To make money off this person? To dig dirt about this person? To make him look bad? To do what? So it took some time to earn the trust of these people. So I had to build goodwill, even after I found them. So after finding people by using the phone book, I would have to earn their trust. In many cases, I'd write letters, introduce myself, send clips that I had done, and then request an interview, and then do the interview, and then do the interview in person. But in some cases, there are some spheres in which none of that works, where there's some spheres where it's appropriate to send an email questions. There are other spheres where it's appropriate to make a phone call. There are other spheres where it's appropriate to write a formal letter of introduction and show as a sign of respect and build goodwill with the person. And then there are other spheres where you have to earn trust in other ways. And now, Strayhorn was the president of an organization called the Copacetic, which was a fraternal organization that put on a full-blown musical show once a year. There was a charity benefit for Harlem. And Strayhorn wrote all the music for this show and wrote the orchestrations. He did not conduct them. Milton Larkin conducted them for every year for over a decade. So he composed dozens and dozens of pieces of work, never recorded, never published, all work undocumented. The Copacetic shows were the highlight of the social season in Harlem and in black culture. They would be covered with a series of articles in the African American press and the black press and the New York Amsterdam and the Amsterdam News and the New York Age. The black magazines Sepia and Jet would do 4, 6, 8-page photo spreads all about the Copacetic shows. They were completely ignored in the white press. So if you looked in the index of the New York Times during the 1950s and looked for the Copacetics, there was nothing. No white reporters ever went up there to report, to cover them. It's as if these shows didn't exist. So I needed to learn about these shows. And so I had to enter this demimonde, which to me was a demimonde. The black papers were not indexed, so there's no way to type in or to even look in a print index for the copacetic in the black papers, because there was no funding for the black papers to be indexed. So I'd have to sit through microfilm and scroll through literally every page of every issue, every week, every month, every year, to find these articles. And then after doing that, I had to get the information about the copacetics. I had to find the copacetics and then build trust with the members, with the copacetics, with this group. They were mostly tap dancers and other performers. How did I do that? You would think, call them, write a letter. That's not appropriate. That's not the correct. That's not a sign of respect within this world. So what I had to do was go to the bar they hung out in, which was the Showman's Cafe, and go there. Every now and then, go there for 1 week, have a drink, be a good guy, let it be seen that I'm a good guy, come back the next, you leave a nice tip, not too much, not too little, dress appropriately, behave respectfully, but not obsequiously. All the codes are very specific and important. It's come back the next week, have another drink, maybe talk for a minute to somebody, so that the community is getting a sense of who this person is. And only over time would I start to talk about, I'm working about a book about Billy Strayhorn, and I'm looking to talk to the copacetics. And in time, they came to me. Honey Coles came to me and said, "Oh, are you the guy working on the book about Strayhorn?" "Yeah." "So, yeah, I knew Billy. What do you want to know?" Like, in time, like that. That was the appropriate system. That was the appropriate way to work in that world. There's no one way, and there are different modes of operation that are effective and appropriate for various spheres of endeavor. And if you have a couple more days, I could keep going. But I think I'll stop there, and because our time's running short, and take whatever questions you have. And they could be about comics and the new book, The Tencent Plague. I could talk about Bob Dylan and his world, or Billy Strayhorn and his world, or pool, if you want to talk about pool. Any questions?
One thing you haven't mentioned is how you got interested in doing this book, because your previous books were about very different genre, and I don't think it's quite the right word, aspects of culture, perhaps. So what caused you to start looking into this?
It's a good question how I got interested in this topic and why I chose this topic. One is I've always loved comics, and I drew when I was young, and in fact I had a comic strip in high school, published in my high school paper. It was kind of an undergroundy thing called The Endless Odyssey of Skip Tumaloo. I thought it was clever. And then the very first work that I had published was illustrations for my local newspaper. So I was interested in comics, interested in art. They were kind of in my bones. But I'm interested in a lot of other things too, and I haven't written about them. I'm interested in pool. I like to bike. I like coffee. I haven't written a book about coffee. So it was partly responding to my own enthusiasms, passions, what I know. But more than that, I thought that there was a story here that was not fully known and worth telling the world. And what happened in my case was that my first book was about the popular music and the popular culture of the first half of the 20th century through the lives of one of its towering figures, Duke Ellington, and his collaborator. The second book was about the popular music of the second half of the 20th century through the lives of two towering figures, Bob Dylan and Joan Baez, and other people in their circle. But while I was researching the second book, researching how that culture came to be and how it was started. When I was researching the nature of popular culture in the second half of the 20th century and how it started, I accepted, no reason not to, I think the standard origin story about the 20th century post-war popular culture, that the kind of the cynicism that we think of as being part of that aesthetic and part of that culture, the cynicism in particular toward authority, the absorption with youth, the irreverence, the absorption with violence and kind of bad behavior, absorption with prurience, the perception of violence as kind of play. I thought that all this started in one way or another with rock and roll. I didn't realize at first that it started earlier. Actually, it was a comment by Jerry Garcia that got me thinking, it made me thinking that maybe there was something before rock and roll, because he made a comment about the importance of EC comics to him. And he said something to the effect that, for me, it all started with EC. So then I started looking into what's EC? What all started with EC? What's he talking about? So in a way, the three books are connected. Anything else?
Actually, yes. Apologies if this is brought up in the book, but it does have the subtitle of American Culture. And one thing about comics, well, this is going to be a little bit rambling here. Comics and jazz are frequently considered some of the rare art forms that originate in America. But comics in Europe and Japan, manga and the like, are considered, while also for children, also considered for adults, and generally more accepted in terms of comic book reading until, say, the last decade or so, when comics pretty much came back from the 50s and being relegated and self-censored, if nothing else. Do you have any thoughts about how the foreign culture reacted to comics and reacted to the American dumbing down of comics, as it were?
It's a good question. And why is there a difference between the way that comics are perceived in other cultures and the way that they're perceived now? Well, as we speak, as we stand here today, there is more parity than difference in the way that comics are perceived in Europe and Eastern cultures and the United States. They're taken pretty seriously pretty much everywhere now. But what happened was, from the early days of comics in the late 1930s to today, the progress of comics evolution and the rate at which there's a little voice of dissent from the rate. I lost my train of thought. Oh, they evolved at different rates at various places, and they were accepted more quickly elsewhere, in large part because of this controversy that stopped comics cold, slowed down their development in some countries, principally in the United States, but also in the UK, and in Canada, where there was just as much hysteria around comics as there was here. So I think the set of events that my book is about, that the Tencent Plague are the answer to the question. Why is there a difference? Because there was no hysteria about comics in Mexico. There was no hysteria about comics in Japan. There was not that much hysteria about comics. There was no hysteria about comics in France. There was very little in Germany. So as a result, the art form was able to mature and evolve more quickly in those other environments and be recognized sooner as an art form than it was here. Any other questions?
That'll do for me.
Ricky? Thank you very much.
Two questions. One, to follow up on your answer to the first question. What are you working on now? And then my other question is, comic books have kind of made a resurgence lately as objects in other forms of popular culture. I'm thinking specifically of novels by people like Michael Chabon and Jonathan Lethem. What do you make of that?
Yeah, two questions. What was the first one? I forgot it already.
What are you working on now?
Oh, what am I working on That's what I really want to talk about. Let me answer the second question first. Why the interest in comic books and contemporary culture now? Well, most of the interest, you're talking about how popular comic book subjects are in the movies, really, is what you're talking about. And that has to do with the function of movies in the society today, and the movies in the culture today, and the fact that movies are so expensive, and they have to provide a kind of pleasure that's distinct, not just pleasure, they have to provide an experience that's significantly distinct from the experience of the web or the television or other media. So because comic books are centered in fantasy, and they're larger than life, and they're yes, we have another additional point. We have an answer to your question from a guest, but let me just finish my thought, and then you pick up, okay?
Just on what you're saying, though, you're basically talking about the large fantasy, but there's also been like Road to Perdition, Ghost World, American Splendor, many more non-fantastic
Right,
comics.
that's true too. Well, it's an additional point. It's a very good one. That one of the functions of movies is to provide a kind of experience that's unique and extravagant and big and large in life. And comic books do that. Comic book subjects do that. Then there's separately we talked earlier about the evolution of comics and the ascendancy of the graphic novel form, and which is a serious form of literature. And I think Ghost World, Daniel Clow's Ghost World, is among the best pieces of writing of any kind published in my lifetime. I think it could stand shoulder to shoulder with any novel or any other work of creative expression made since I was born. So, Ghost World, which was a smallish graphic novel, even though it was popular, and a smallish film, appeals to kind of an elite group of smart connoisseurs, to a different audience than the blockbuster Spider-Man movies. So they're different works that have different functions in the culture. And what am I working on? I'm doing another biography of African-American jazz musician from Pittsburgh named Billy. So it's part two. I'm doing a biography of a largely forgotten jazz singer out of Pittsburgh named Billy Eckstein. And I've been working on that for about a year now. So it's coming along, and I should be done in another 4 years. So a book takes me about 5 years. Anything else? I think we have time for one more question, and if there aren't any, I'll just say thank you very much. This was a great thrill, and if anybody does want to play pool, $1 a ball, and I'll be right over there. Thank you.